So I was talking about the case of a monopolist now coming into the market and supplying this good to the entire market. And because the monopolist is a price setter, it influences the price with supply, and therefore its marginal revenue cost is going to slope downwards and lie below the demand curve. Because with each additional quantity sold, less revenue comes in because they have to attract the buyer who is willing to pay less for the good than is buyers higher up the demand, than are buyers higher up the demand curve, right? Okay, so you have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that lies below the demand curve in the case of a monopolist. Now, the basic rule for optimal supply, that is the supply that maximizes profits in the case of the monopolist, remains marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? So that's given by this point over here, which I think is omega. That being said, the price that people are willing to pay at this quantity, at QM, so now quantity is reduced, as you can see, from QC to QM. First thing we notice. Second thing we notice is that the price that consumers are paying at that new quantity is given by beta. Now, using the idea of consumer and producer surplus, we notice that there's been a decrease in and also an increase in producer surplus. Under perfect competition, consumer surplus is given by the area that I'm shading over here. So that's the area given by the triangle where the demand curve intersects with the price axis up to the point E1 and then across to the point alpha, right? So this is traditionally consumer surplus. Forgive my poor writing on the screen here. In this case, producer surplus, on the other hand, will be given by the area between the price and the supply curve, right? So this is producer surplus. And this is now all under perfect competition, okay? If we get rid of perfect competition and we install a monopoly in this market, then this no longer holds those levels of producer and consumer surplus. In fact, consumer surplus is reduced to this area now. Remember, the price is now given by beta, and consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price level. So consumer surplus now reduced to this red area, whereas producer surplus now becomes this entire area over here. Up to point QM, from 0 to QM, there hasn't been a change in the overall surplus. When you're thinking of societal welfare, overall, there hasn't been a change up to QM. But there has been a loss now to society as a whole, given by this area over here, delta E1 omega, right? This green shaded area. This is gone. This surplus no longer exists. It doesn't exist for consumers. It doesn't exist for producers. And that's what we call the deadweight loss to society. And there's been a somewhat of a transfer of surplus from households to firms in this case. Another thing to note that is noted in the textbook is that there's just no production taking place between QM and QC, right? So resources that were deployed to the production of this particular good, to the level, to the quantity of QC minus QM, is no longer being deployed for that purpose, right? Under perfect competition, we assume that resources flow to their best uses, and also they flow to the production processes that reflect society's wants, that reflect the wants and desires of consumers, and that gives rise to allocatable efficiency. So when you have a situation where resources are now being diverted, and one would presume, given that this is one single market that we're talking about, one would presume that the resources that were being committed to the production of QC of this good, the difference between that and QM is now being directed elsewhere in the economy. This may then result in allocative inefficiency, right? So even if the monopolist is producing as efficiently as it can at MC equals MR, at marginal cost equals marginal revenue. The resources it is not using is going to some other purpose, which was not necessarily desirable under perfect competition. Okay. So this slide just goes through all of the points that I just made on that graph. So I don't think I'm not going to read this to you, but it's there for you to look at. Yeah, just to emphasize this point at the bottom, that in addition to this dead weight loss to society that we talked about, the loss in production may not be efficiently utilized elsewhere in the economy. And at the very least, when you have this situation of perfect monopoly, you necessarily lose allocative efficiency, because the desires that society would have had under perfect competition are not being met in the presence of a monopoly. All right, and that's the point that's been made on this slide. If you consider the outcome for the economy in the two good case, if the market for good Y is monopolistic, there's a monopoly producing Y, and the market for good X is competitive, then the marginal rate of product transformation between X and Y will be larger than the ratio of the prices of goods X and Y. And the reason for that is that this denominator over here, dy, will be higher. As we saw in this graph, when a monopoly comes into being in a previously perfectly competitive market, the price goes up, in this case from alpha to beta. So the price over here will be different. And even though you can be at a point on the production possibilities frontier, remember the MRPT is effectively the slope of the production possibilities frontier, that might not reflect the ratio of the prices, which in turn is a reflection of the point of tangency between the respective utility functions of the consumers in our group, if you remember our neoclassical model. So the relative prices don't match the relative marginal costs, and the economy is producing lesser good Y than is allocatively efficient. Okay, so remember this distinction between allocative efficiency and X efficiency. In addition, monopolistic production can result in X inefficiency, and this is due to a lack of competition, right? So the idea is that efficiency is induced, productive efficiency is induced by competition among firms. And absent that competition, in the case of monopolies, it could result in a lack of efficiency in production because the competitive pressure is no longer there. On the other hand, there are arguments that this is not the case, and that in fact, that having monopolies can actually improve on efficiency, production efficiency. And that is because firms make excess profits, right? That's one of the outcomes of having a monopoly, is that the firm is making an excess profit. Price is higher than the marginal cost, right? And those excess profits can, in theory, be invested into improving production efficiencies. So that's the caveat that was raised by Schumpeter, who stated that monopolists have an incentive, or who suggested that monopolists have an incentive given shareholder interests, and they have the resources given the excess profits to invest in technological innovation that promotes efficiency rather than results in X inefficiency. So this idea that the MRPT no longer equals the ratio of the respective prices of the two goods X and Y is shown on this graph here. So here you have a production possibilities frontier given by the curve ROTO. Now, if C was the allocatively efficient level of production of goods X and Y, then under perfect competition, and you have a situation where a monopolist comes in and takes over one of the industries, the production of good Y in this case, then you can see a movement along the MRPT under the assumption that the monopolist results in that the monopolist maintains the same level of efficiency in production. You see a movement along the frontier to a point MO. Okay? So still on the production possibilities frontier, right? Still Pareto optimal in terms of production. However, it is now allocatively inefficient, right? This point over here uniquely represents the desires of society in this framework, whereas this point does not. Okay, and that is shown by the fact that the slope of the price ratios is not tangent to the curve here; it passes through. Right. If we consider the fact, or if we take seriously the idea that a monopoly can, in addition to resulting in allocative inefficiency, can result in technical inefficiency, we might end up at a point that is somewhere inside of the production possibilities frontier, right? So not only allocatively inefficient, but also inefficient, inefficient, or technically inefficient. On the other hand, if Schumpeter is right, and he suggests that even monopolies are subject to shareholder pressure, even monopolies face the incentive to promote production, you could end up at a point on a higher production possibilities frontier, such as M2, for example. So you could push out the frontier by having a monopoly that invests in production. Moving on, if a monopoly is being created through regulation, then deregulation is the simplest response to dealing with that. And ESCOM is a great example here. The monopoly of ESCOM is fundamentally due to regulation, and we are currently in the process of deregulating to not entirely like some other countries where all power is privately supplied, but there are some moves towards deregulation at the margins. Other examples of deregulation would be lowering licensing requirements, lowering taxes on certain activities, reducing companies tax, for example, as a very broad sort of example, and also changing zoning rights and so on for land use, etc. So by addressing the issue of monopoly in the market, you could, in theory, induce more allocative efficiency, as well as greater technical efficiency or efficiency. We also saw that having a monopoly can go the other way as well, and can produce these outcomes as well. So one of the questions that I would ask you guys is whether you believe there is this trade-off between innovation and competition. So the slide that I've gone through now suggests contrasting views on this, right? So one view suggests that having a monopoly lands us at either point M or point MO, point M1, or in the very best scenario, lands us at point MO then. Another view suggests that having a monopoly might land us on a higher efficiency frontier, maybe at point M2. One person who takes the side of Schumpeter is Peter Thiel, who wrote this book 0 to 1, in which he promotes the idea of monopoly and encourages people to try and start monopolies. So he's a big proponent of monopolies. Now let's consider the case of the natural monopoly. This is the case where you have decreasing costs as a given firm expands its production, the average cost goes down, which in turn suggests that firms should produce as much as they can, as long as that is the case, as long as the average cost is going down, right? Okay, so national monopoly arises typically when you have high capital costs, and these in turn create economies of scale. And in such a situation, you can have a case where one firm is sufficient to serve the entire market for this particular group. And again, electricity used to be, and in some cases is an example of this. Things like the provision of water is another example of this, where, as well as public transport networks, specifically rail. Taxis are private enterprises, but they use infrastructure that was built by government. But when it comes to rail, sewage, water supply, anything that requires massive capital investment, massive infrastructure, is often best served by a monopoly. It can also occur in the private sector, so it's not just things that traditionally were publicly provided. In the scenario of national monopolies, marginal cost lies below the average cost over the range of production, over the range of output to serve the market. What this means ultimately is that any attempt to compete in this market will result in losses to all firms in the market, because they will have to reduce the price. And ultimately, in the case of perfect competition, if you have price equals marginal cost, and marginal cost lies below average cost, firm at that point is making a loss, not a profit, right? And we can look at this graphically. So again, we have the same situation as before, although this time we include the average cost curve in the graph, and you can see that it's downward sloping all the way up to the point where marginal cost intersects with the demand curve. And at that point, you have the marginal cost lying below the demand curve, right? So if you have a perfectly competitive market for this good or service, the perfect competition outcome is given by point E, which results in quantity of QE and the price of PE. But this results in a loss. Notice that the average cost lies above the marginal cost, lies above point E in this case, right? So although the price per quantity received by firms is PE, which is given over here, the cost per quantity is given over here. So there's this loss that all firms will be subject to should there be a perfect competition. Ultimately, firms will start closing down, and one monopoly will eventually emerge, right? Because of the nature of the market. Now, what happens when that monopolist eventually comes about? Again, they're going to produce where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, which is given by point M over here. So again, we notice a reduction in the quantity supplied in the market. And again, we notice an increase in the price that consumers have to pay for this good, right? As quantity goes down from QE to QM, price goes up from PE to PM, which is associated with point F here on the demand curve, right? That's why households are willing to pay that price for this good at that quantity. So here you have a significant loss in consumer surplus, right? The loss, in fact, is equal to this shaded area, part of which is again transferred to firms, but a part of it is simply lost, right? Again, you have a deadweight loss to society as a result of. Now let's talk about some of the responses that government can have in this instance. So should the monopolist be a firm and not a state entity, then the earlier analysis again holds. That is, you have this deadweight loss. The price goes up, quantity, supply goes down. Fewer goods are produced at higher cost than is socially optimal. Also, there's a transfer of consumer surplus in addition to a general loss of welfare to society. Now, if the sector is one that serves as an input for other sectors, there's clearly a significant social benefit to be gained by increasing production and lowering the costs. One option government has in this case is to nationalize the monopoly and subsidize the production equal to the difference between average and marginal cost. In other words, a government can take over this firm, either take it over or start it, and then it can produce at QE, right? Under government control, the firm can produce at QE, or the state entity now can produce at QE, and the government can just subsidize this difference here between E and S, right? But of course, subsidizing that means government has to channel resources or financing in that direction. In other words, government has to pay for it. How does government pay for things? Well, there's two ways. One is by collecting taxes, and the other is through borrowing. And both of these things will have knock-on effects elsewhere in the economy. Subsidizing a loss-making monopoly would have to be funded through taxation or borrowing, both of which will have additional implications, perhaps elsewhere in the economy. One argument that is always made is that taxes distort prices of factors and goods and services, which in and of itself results in a welfare loss. And we will talk about excess burdens imposed by taxes and so on later on. On the other hand, if government, so that's, if government adds an additional tax or raises taxes in the economy, this will have knock-on effects in other markets, which also result in welfare losses. One has to weigh the losses elsewhere with the benefits of raising production in this particular market. Then there's the option of raising debt, which could result in a crowding out of private investment because of it increases interest rates. And both of these caveats, one can argue, are sort of manifest in South Africa in the Eskom situation. Okay, I think I'm going to end it there. It's almost 9:30.